In Eisenhower's farewell address of 1961, he laid out some of the important challenges facing the nation at the time. One of his key concerns was about what he called the military-industrial complex. He worried that the close relationship between the military and the defense industry would undermine the country's political system, and cautioned that great care was needed to prevent this. In this video, we're going to look at the context of Eisenhower's warning, and then examine what the military-industrial complex looks like and how it operates today. All of the sources for this video can be found through the link in the description, so don't forget to check that out. The Industrial Revolution and the rapid advance of technology in the 1800s brought many changes to the military world and the industries that supplied it. Some of the new technologies included railroads, automatic machine guns, battleships, modern artillery, and later, aircraft. The British Empire, the dominant global power at the time, was a leader in developing and adopting many of these technologies. There was a significant increase in the number and variety of weapons and other military technologies. This led to an expansion of military industry. Many companies sought to profit by developing and producing these new weapons. Basil Zaharoff, also known as the Merchant of Death, became one of the wealthiest people in the world, working as a global arms dealer. In the years leading up to World War I, there was intense competition between the great powers of Europe, who were seeking to acquire these new technologies and stay ahead of the many new advancements that were being made. The companies that fed this arms race benefited from this situation, and in the war that followed, which was unprecedented in scale, even greater profits were made. After the war, retired U.S. General Smedley Butler described in his book War is a Racket some of the war profiteering that took place in the United States. Companies that supplied weapons, as well as those that supplied materials and other goods, all profited from the war. These included DuPont, which was the main producer of gunpowder for the Allies, steel producers such as Bethlehem Steel and United States Steel, as well as leather and shoe manufacturers, the American Sugar Refining Company, and many others. For many of these companies, their profits increased several 100% compared to before the war. Profiting from war was nothing new. Throughout history, there have been those who made a profit by selling equipment and supplies to warring armies. What was new was the massive scale and industrialization of military production, along with the growing variety and complexity of military technologies. With the start of World War II, the large production and research needs brought on by the war led to a strong effort to establish cooperation between the military and the private sector. Companies such as Ford and General Motors switched to wartime production. Their factories produced tanks, aircraft, and other military equipment on a massive scale. In the area of research, the Office of Scientific Research and Development was established to coordinate military research at universities and private laboratories. This research arrangement was very important in helping the U.S. deal with the many complex technological challenges it was facing. It was very effective, and many important new technologies were developed. These close, wartime partnerships between government and the private sector would become the foundation of the military-industrial complex that developed in the years after the war. At the end of the war, there was a massive demobilization. Factories went back to making cars and other domestic products. Defense spending dropped from almost 40% of GDP to 4%. This did not last long, however. With the beginning of the Korean War and the growing conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, defense spending rose again. At the end of the Korean War, spending fell, but only somewhat. It remained high at around 9% of GDP for the rest of the decade. A major change had occurred. In the past, large-scale defense spending had been limited to periods of war. Now spending remained high, and a large, permanent military industry was maintained. This was the beginning of the military-industrial complex. The threat of the Soviet Union, along with the increasing complexity of military technology, drove this change. Because a potential war with the Soviet Union could begin at any moment and would likely be a very fast-paced conflict, it was no longer possible to rely on private sector industries to convert to military production in the event of war. This would take too long, and many important military technologies would be too complex for them to produce. In addition, the rapid pace of technological advancement and the growing complexity of military technology meant that a permanent system for research and development was needed. The new technologies of the era, such as missiles, nuclear weapons, and modern jet aircraft, with their many advanced subsystems, required continual investment if they were to remain competitive. In order to meet these challenges, the U.S. relied on its partnerships with private contractors that focused on defense production. The defense industry thrived as a result. By 1961, when Eisenhower gave his speech, the military-industrial complex had been developing for around a decade and was now well established. Much of this took place during his presidency. Eisenhower believed in the need for a permanent defense industry in order to confront the Soviet Union, but he also had concerns about what this new system would mean for the United States. Throughout his presidency, he had made controlling the military budget a priority. He worried that defense spending could easily get out of control and become a major burden on the American people. He was also concerned that if it grew too powerful, the military-industrial complex could even undermine the country's system of government. Eisenhower believed that in order to prevent these problems and maintain a proper balance in government, the influence of the military-industrial complex had to be resisted. As a hero of World War II and one of America's greatest generals, Eisenhower was well positioned to make the case for limiting military spending. As he was leaving office, though, he worried that his successor, John F. Kennedy, would fail to do the same. He was concerned that Kennedy would not be able to resist the many political pressures that would drive an ever-increasing military budget. Eisenhower's concerns were justified by the fact that during his presidential campaign, Kennedy had pushed the idea that there was a large missile gap between the Soviet Union and the United States. This was mostly an exaggeration, but could serve as a justification for greatly increasing defense spending. Throughout Kennedy's administration and the rest of the Cold War, the threat of the Soviet Union would successfully be used for this purpose. The ongoing conflict would ensure that defense spending remained high and that the military-industrial complex was sustained. Today, there are 5 main companies that make up the defense industry. During the Cold War era, there were many more, but in the 1990s, many of these companies began to merge and consolidate. The Pentagon encouraged this because they felt that having fewer contractors would bring benefits and would better suit the post-Cold War environment. These companies are Boeing, General Dynamics, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and Raytheon. For most of them, defense contracts are their primary source of income. The Lockheed Corporation merged with Martin Marietta in 1995 to become Lockheed Martin. It is the largest defense contractor. It made around $65 billion in revenue for 2022 and received $47 billion from its contracts with the government. It employs around 116,000 people. Lockheed Martin mostly produces aircraft and missile systems and is the owner of the contract for the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, which is one of the most expensive military projects in history. In 2020, the Raytheon Company merged with United Technologies Corporation, another top 10 defense contractor, to form the Raytheon Technologies Corporation. Raytheon is the next largest contractor, making around $67 billion in 2022, $27 billion of which were from government contracts. It employs around 180,000 people. Raytheon also primarily makes aerospace technologies such as missiles, aircraft parts and systems, and satellites. General Dynamics received around $25 billion from its contracts with the government in 2022 and had $39 billion in revenue. It makes submarines and surface ships and ground vehicles such as the M1 Abrams. Boeing makes around $16 billion annually from its government contracts and has a total revenue of around $66 billion. Most of Boeing's business is in the commercial aerospace industry, which includes its 700 series of commercial airliners. It also produces military aircraft and is the maker of the Apache helicopter and the B-52 bomber. Northrop Grumman makes a variety of electronic systems used by the military, as well as aircraft and missiles. Northrop Grumman had around $36 billion of revenue for 2022, $15 billion of which were from government contracts. These 5 companies are not only the biggest contractors for the U.S. military, they are also the biggest arms dealers globally. And they are among the 100 largest U.S. companies by revenue. Some other important defense contractors are L3Harris, Leidos, Honeywell, Huntington Ingalls, and BAE Systems. With the start of the War on Terror in the early 2000s, U.S. military spending increased greatly. It rose from 3.1% of GDP in 2000 to 4.9% in 2010, or in current dollars, from $320 billion to $738 billion. During this period, there was a boom in the contracting world. The Department of Defense entered into contracts for everything from weapons, munitions, and maintenance to construction projects and laundry services. Contracts were increasingly used for a variety of support services in addition to military equipment. The Department of Defense also even began to hire private military companies to conduct combat operations. From 2001 to 2021, the U.S. spent a total of around $14 trillion on defense. 1/3 to 1/2 of this, or around $4.5 to $7 trillion, went to contractors. Currently, around $400 billion a year, or about half of all military spending, goes to contractors. Of this spending on contracts, Lockheed Martin receives about 11%, Raytheon about 6%, General Dynamics 5%, and Boeing and Northrop Grumman around 3%. The rest is split between hundreds of other smaller contractors. Over the past 2 decades of the War on Terror, the top 5 contractors have done very well. Their growth has been much greater than the average of other top companies in the U.S. economy. Each year, the Department of Defense submits a budget request to Congress. For 2024, the request was for $910 billion. Within this budget, decisions must be made about what types of equipment to purchase, what programs to fund, which contractors should be used, and so on. The military leaders who are involved in making these decisions have a great deal of power over the contractors who are looking to sell to the military. Defense contractors have a strong motivation to influence them so that they make decisions that are beneficial to the industry. This brings us to the question of what is the military-industrial complex. This phrase is meant to describe the relationships between leaders in the military and the defense industry. These relationships can have a big influence on decisions that are made about defense spending. One of the most important things that creates and defines these relationships is the revolving door between the military establishment and the defense industry. It is important to understand this revolving door and the effect that it has. An official report from 2021 by the Government Accountability Office looked at the scale of the revolving door. The report looked at individuals who left the Department of Defense from 2014 through 2019 and at how many of them were working for the top 14 defense contractors in 2019. Of the approximately 1.5 million people who left the Department of Defense, about 37,000 of them were employed by the top 14 defense contractors. This is about 2.5%. However, this study is limited in that it fails to focus on individuals at the highest and thus most influential levels of the Department of Defense. Another study, by the Quincy Institute, looked at retiring 4-star generals and admirals, the highest-ranking officers in the military. From 2018 to 2023, 25 out of 32, or around 80% of them, went to work for the defense industry. Most of them took positions as board members, advisors, lobbyists, or consultants. Some took executive positions, including one at Lockheed Martin. A similar study, looking at high-ranking officers, was done by the Boston Globe. It looked at the careers of 750 3- and 4-star generals and admirals during the 1990s and 2000s. From 2004 to 2008, around 80% of them went to work for the defense industry. In some years, as many as 90% did. The study also found that in the early 90s, the number of retiring officers who joined the defense industry was lower at around 50%. This is still a lot, but it suggests that the number of retiring officers joining the defense industry has increased since the 1990s. The Project on Government Oversight created a database to track the hiring of former high-ranking Department of Defense officials. From 2018 through 2021, they identified over 479 senior officials who joined defense contractors or companies that perform lobbying and consulting for them. This includes over 150 generals and 89 admirals. Boeing hired 23 former officials, Raytheon and Northrop Grumman 24, and Lockheed Martin hired 44. Some of the prominent military leaders who have gone to the defense industry in recent years include Joseph Dunford, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who joined Lockheed Martin, John Richardson, chief of naval operations, who went to Boeing, and David Goldfein, chief of staff of the Air Force, who joined Draken International. Another example is Heidi Grant, who is director of the DSCA within the Department of Defense, which manages and reviews foreign arms sales by defense contractors. She retired and the very next day joined Boeing. She had been in contract negotiations while still serving as the director. Often, individuals join the defense industry after taking actions that directly benefited their future employers. One example of this is General James Cartwright, vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who, after advocating to save the program for the J-lens sensor system, a program that the Army wanted to cancel because it was not meeting expectations, joined the board of directors for Raytheon, which held the contract for the system. Another example is General James Mattis, who advocated for the use of Theranos equipment by the Army. When he retired, he took a position on the board of Theranos, where he was paid $150,000 a year. Probably the most extreme case is that of Darlene Druyan, who was a civilian official who served as the principal deputy undersecretary of the Air Force and oversaw the Air Force's weapons acquisition program from 1993 to 2002. After retiring, there were questions about a wasteful aircraft leasing deal that she had approved with Boeing. The deal would have led to several $billion in unnecessary costs. When she retired, she had taken a job at Boeing. She had also previously helped her daughter and son-in-law get jobs at Boeing. She was investigated over this and eventually pled guilty and served 9 months in prison. It became clear that she had also given Boeing very favorable terms in a number of earlier contracts, likely wasting billions of dollars. Only in extreme cases are these revolving door relationships viewed as a problem. For the most part, these close relationships between military officials and private companies are completely normalized. There is even a program called From the Battlefield to the Boardroom that prepares retired and soon-to-retire generals and other officers to join corporate boards, including those of defense contractors. The issue that the revolving door creates is that high-ranking officers may be influenced to push for policies that benefit defense companies but are not necessarily in the best interest of the military or the country. They know that many of their colleagues have taken jobs with the defense industry, and they know that they will likely also have this opportunity. This understanding incentivizes them to act in ways that protect the interests of the industry. They may support programs that are inefficient or flawed, not push for lower costs on contracts, and so on. If they were to act in ways contrary to the interests of the defense industry, they would be jeopardizing their future employment opportunities. In 1959, Vice Admiral Hyman Rickover described these pressures that were facing military leaders even at that time. He stated, "I myself don't get pressured by outsiders, but they do go higher up and get pressure put on me that way. It is generally in the nature of urging me to undertake new projects which we consider not worthwhile. It is almost subversive not to want to spend government money." Defense contractors benefit from the revolving door by the influence it has on officers while they are still in the military, but also from the influence these officers can have when they retire and join the defense industry. Once they retire, high-ranking officers are often hired as lobbyists, where they directly advocate on behalf of the defense industry, pushing for policies that benefit their employers. Due to their many connections and their high status within the military, they can have a lot of influence. In one instance, several retired officers played a key role in preserving a flawed program within the Navy. The Navy wanted to retire several of its littoral combat ships, which were specialized in near-shore operations. These ships were produced years behind schedule and cost around twice what they were supposed to. On top of this, they had a number of serious flaws, including engine failures. The Navy did not want to spend any more money on these ships and planned to retire several of them. This resulted in a major lobbying effort directed at Congress and led by retired Navy officers who are now working for defense contractors. As a result, Congress blocked the Navy from retiring 5 out of the 9 ships it wanted to retire. Interestingly, these ships had involved a variety of defense contractors. Lockheed Martin was one of the prime contractors tasked with making the ships. Raytheon designed a special sonar system for them, General Dynamics trained the crews who operated them, and BAE Systems had a contract worth hundreds of millions of dollars to service the ships. In addition, retired officers are sometimes brought back to serve on advisory boards for the Pentagon. They can serve on these boards while at the same time being employed by defense companies. Retired officers also have an influence through their presence in the media. Retired generals working for defense contractors are often brought on cable news to discuss ongoing conflicts and U.S. defense policy. They often advocate for strong U.S. intervention. When they are brought on, they are almost always introduced according to their former position within the military, and their current employment within the defense industry is not mentioned. The revolving door also describes individuals coming into the military establishment from the defense industry. Individuals coming into the system are often placed in very high positions where they have a lot of power. One key position in the Department of Defense is the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition. This person is responsible for acquiring, maintaining, distributing, and developing all weapons and equipment for the military. 2 recent long-term appointees to the position both had strong ties to the defense industry. Ellen Lord, who held the position from 2017 to 2021, was previously president and CEO of Textron Systems, which makes military vehicles and is a large Department of Defense contractor. From 2011 to 2017, Frank Kendall III held the position. Prior to that, he had served as the Vice President of Engineering for Raytheon. After leaving the Department of Defense in 2017, he joined the board of Leidos, and in 2021, he returned to government to become Secretary of the Air Force. The Secretary of Defense is the highest position within the Department of Defense. Many recent Secretaries of Defense have also had strong ties with the defense industry. The current Secretary of Defense, General Lloyd Austin, retired from the military in 2016. That year, he joined the board of United Technologies, and later the board of Raytheon when the companies merged. In 2021, he was nominated and confirmed as Secretary of Defense, moving from the private sector back into government. There were some that questioned his appointment because of his connections with Raytheon, but they were a minority. Prior to Austin, the Secretary of Defense was Mark Esper. Esper had been Vice President for Government Relations at Raytheon, the top government lobbying position in the company. His deal with Raytheon upon leaving the company included a plan for him to receive over $1 million in deferred payments after several years. The Secretary of Defense before Esper, General James Mattis, had joined the board of General Dynamics after retiring from the military in 2013. In 2017, he became the Secretary of Defense. When Mattis resigned in 2019, he was temporarily replaced by his Deputy Secretary of Defense, Patrick Shanahan, who also had ties to the defense industry, having worked for Boeing for 30 years. This revolving door that brings individuals from the defense industry into the highest positions in the Department of Defense is widely accepted and normalized. Both Democratic and Republican presidents have nominated people with close ties to the defense industry to become Secretaries of Defense, and the Senate generally approves them with very little concern. Military leaders who take part in the revolving door and political leaders who are meant to have oversight over these activities fail to recognize or ignore the serious problems that arise as a result of this practice. The term military-industrial complex has been widely adopted since Eisenhower first used it. Historians, however, have debated whether his speech was originally going to include a different phrase. Eisenhower understood that the problem he was describing was not just about the relationships between the military and the defense industry, but that Congress played a key role as well. A more accurate and complete description is that there is a military-industrial congressional complex. In many ways, the relationship between members of Congress and the defense industry are far more significant. Congress is ultimately in control of all federal spending. Because of this, they have the greatest control over the defense budget. Congress has in a number of years added tens of billions of dollars to the defense budget above what the Pentagon itself requested. In 2018, the Pentagon requested $665 billion. Congress authorized $692 billion, an increase of $26 billion. In 2022, the request was for $743 billion. Congress increased this by $25 billion. For 2023, the request was for $802 billion, and Congress authorized $847 billion, an increase of $45 billion. The relationship between the defense industry and Congress is defined by campaign contributions, intense lobbying, and a revolving door. During the 2020 election cycle, individuals and PACs associated with the defense industry made around $50 million in political contributions. Of this, around $36 million went to congressional candidates. In the 2022 election cycle, contributions to candidates were around $23 million. The defense industry doesn't spend as much as other industries on campaign contributions. For example, the oil and gas industry spent close to $31 million in 2022, and the real estate industry spent over $120 million. However, it does target its spending very well. For 2022, the top recipient of defense PAC spending was Mike Rogers, chair of the House Armed Services Committee, the key committee in the House responsible for setting the defense budget. Rogers is a close ally of the defense industry. In 2021, he introduced an amendment to increase the defense budget by $25 billion. In 2022, he fought for support of an amendment that would add $37 billion to the budget. The second highest recipient was Ken Calvert, chairman of the House Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, another key committee with control over defense spending. Another top recipient was Adam Smith, the Democrat who was the chair of the House Armed Services Committee before Mike Rogers from 2019 to 2023. Around one-third of defense industry contributions to members of the House of Representatives went to those on the Armed Services Committee. On average, these 58 members received around $80,000 each for the 2022 election cycle, about 3 times more than the average for those who are not on the committee. Some of the top recipients of defense industry spending from 1990 to the present include John Murtha, former chair of the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, Kay Granger, also a former chair, and currently chair of the House Appropriations Committee, Mike Rogers, and Jim Moran, a former member of the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, who was a close ally of the defense industry, and whose district in Northern Virginia included the Pentagon and the headquarters of many prominent defense companies. From 2003 to 2023, the defense industry made over $370 million in campaign contributions, a large amount, but much less than the $2.7 billion they spent on lobbying. In 2022 alone, they spent over $128 million on lobbying and employed 845 lobbyists. Many of these lobbyists are retired generals and others from the Department of Defense, as well as people who have worked in Congress, especially former congressional staff. Shayna Chandler is one example of this, who after serving for years as Chief of Staff for Adam Smith, the former chair of the House Armed Services Committee, joined General Dynamics as a Director of Government Relations. Others have gone from the industry to become congressional staffers. Another example of this revolving door is former Congressman Buck McKeon, chair of the House Armed Services Committee from 2011 to 2015. He formed a lobbying and consulting firm after retiring. Since 2016, he has been hired as a lobbyist by Lockheed Martin almost every year. His firm has also lobbied for General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman, and other defense contractors. Another important way that defense contractors influence Congress is by leveraging the economic impact of defense spending. They frequently emphasize the number of jobs that their programs create and the money that they bring to states' economies. In addition, the many manufacturing facilities, military bases, and shipyards that are dispersed throughout the country make members of Congress whose congressional districts contain these facilities close allies of the defense industry. They fight to maintain and expand programs that bring contract dollars and jobs to their districts. These programs may not always be in the best interest of the country, and defense spending generally creates fewer jobs than other types of spending, but because the benefits are brought to their districts, they continue to support them. The United States spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined. This is 3 times more than China, which is the second highest spender. About 40% of global spending on defense is by the U.S. This situation is less extreme when adjusting for purchasing power, but the U.S. still dominates. In 2022, the U.S. spent around $750 billion on defense. This is around 12% of the federal budget and around 45% of discretionary federal spending. Of the military budget, around 23%, or $170 billion, goes to personnel. The rest, $580 billion, is spent on operations and maintenance, procurement, research and development, and other activities. Around 3% of GDP is spent on defense, which is much less than in previous decades, but GDP isn't a good baseline for defense spending because growth of the economy does not equate to increased needs of the military or an increase in the threats facing the nation. The U.S. is also the largest arms dealer globally, with exports accounting for about 40% of the total. The next largest arms exporter is Russia at 16%. The influence of the military-industrial complex has ensured that U.S. defense spending remains high and is far above the rest of the world. It has made it so that questioning the defense budget is difficult, and few political leaders do so. This attitude has led to inefficiencies within the defense system that, despite the high spending, make the U.S. military less prepared for a potential war. The Pentagon, after over 20 years of delays in performing a required audit, finally conducted its first audit in 2018. It failed that audit and its next 5 audits. In the most recent audit, conducted in 2023, the Pentagon was unable to properly account for 63% of its $3.8 trillion in assets. Having such a large budget and not being able to properly account for how it is used leaves open the possibility for significant waste and inefficiency. A 2015 internal review by the Pentagon, which was subsequently covered up, discovered $25 billion in annual administrative waste alone. Most of the waste that takes place, however, is around the purchasing of weapons and equipment. Some of this has been highlighted by Shay Assad. Assad was a former executive and contract negotiator for Raytheon, who joined the Department of Defense as a contract negotiator and later became the director of pricing. He has become an outspoken advocate against wasteful spending and price gouging. After a review ordered by Assad in 2015, it was found that Raytheon was overcharging the Pentagon by hundreds of millions of dollars for its Patriot missile systems by greatly exaggerating how much it cost to produce them. A new contract that was negotiated saved over $500 million. In another case, involving the company TransDigm, it was found that the government was paying $119 million for parts that should have cost $28 million. A big reason why the government accepts prices this high is because of the consolidation that has occurred within the defense industry, which has made it so that for many items there is little or no competition. The government is often forced to pay excessive prices because there is only one supplier. Stinger missiles are another example of this. They cost around $25,000 in the 1990s, but today cost over $400,000 now that Raytheon is their only supplier. The consolidation that began in the 1990s has in many areas led to a less efficient, more expensive system. At the time, Pentagon officials thought that having fewer suppliers would mean lower costs and greater efficiency. They thought that they could trust defense suppliers not to overcharge them, despite the fact that they are for-profit companies and their only priority is to make money. This unrealistic view was likely a product of the revolving door and the friendly attitude that many Department of Defense officials had toward the defense industry. Another problem with inefficiency that the Pentagon faces is that many projects end up costing way more than estimated and take years longer than planned. This is especially true for large projects. The F-35 is one example of this. When the contract was awarded to Lockheed Martin in 2001, it was estimated to cost around $233 billion. Since then, costs have increased by $183 billion, and it is now expected to cost over $416 billion. Total costs, including servicing the aircraft throughout its lifespan, are expected to be over $1.7 trillion. The program is also several years behind schedule, and important testing and development milestones have been missed. Despite testing being incomplete, over 100 aircraft are being produced each year. This is because the Pentagon agreed to concurrency, where production would take place while development was still in progress. This has led to billions of dollars in additional costs, as older models have to be updated and fixed as improvements are made and new problems are discovered. As testing is still not complete, there will likely be many more costs in the future. The F-22 program, which also used concurrency, also faced serious problems with rising costs. Originally, the plan was for 750 aircraft to be produced, but as the price per plane increased to over $400 million, the program had to be canceled, with only 187 being made. For both of these programs, the decision to allow concurrency was wasteful of taxpayer money, but was very beneficial for the defense industry. The inability to control costs and have accurate planning around major projects is a significant weakness of the defense system. Resources become tied up, preventing investment in other areas of defense, and the military isn't able to have an accurate view of its future capabilities and needs. During the Vietnam War, peace advocates pointed out the massive profits that defense companies were making selling bombs, aircraft, and other equipment to the military. They saw these profits as a key reason why the U.S. was involved in the war. They believed that the defense industry's influence on government drove the decisions that led to the U.S. getting involved and remaining in the war. Many people hold this view and see the military-industrial complex as a key force that drives U.S. involvement in war. It is important, however, to also understand the central role of ideology in driving U.S. military intervention and defense spending. Many U.S. leaders following World War II adopted the idea that the United States should play a major role in global politics and have frequently advocated for U.S. military action in line with this. Eisenhower himself, while deeply concerned about the military-industrial complex, was not opposed to U.S. intervention. In a number of instances, including Vietnam, he pushed for U.S. involvement. Today, as in the past, there is a mutually beneficial relationship between U.S. leaders who hold this ideology and advocate for an aggressive foreign policy and the defense industry. The defense industry benefits through high levels of defense spending. Political leaders benefit from the financial support they receive through campaign contributions and jobs in the defense industry and closely aligned think tanks. It is also important to understand that while there are certainly profits to be made from wars, the military-industrial complex doesn't need war. What it needs most of all is a threat that can justify high defense spending. The military-industrial complex began with the Cold War and the threat of the Soviet Union. Although the U.S. never fought a direct war with the Soviet Union, military spending rose to record levels and remained high. During the 1980s, spending increased significantly, but not because the U.S. was engaged in a major war. The Reagan administration chose to challenge the Soviet Union by increasing defense spending. This was a matter of policy, not of war. After the Cold War, the War on Terror became the major justification for defense spending, and spending reached record levels. This despite the fact that the threats facing the United States were far less extreme than during the Cold War. In recent years, the threat of a rising China is increasingly used as the justification for an expanding defense budget. Military and political leaders push many expensive programs based on the possibility that there could be war with China. They claim that large investments in defense will deter Chinese aggression and prevent war. However, it's important to keep in mind that there is a thin line between deterrence and provocation. The defense industry and its ideological allies will always advocate for the most aggressive foreign policy. They will always see military solutions as the only option for international problems. The result of this would be an ever-increasing defense budget. Eisenhower was concerned that the priorities of government would be distorted by the influence of the military-industrial complex. He knew how expensive war was, and that an ever-growing defense budget would take away from the country's other important priorities. In a speech he gave shortly after becoming president, he stated, "Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired, signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed." He also pointed out how the cost of one modern heavy bomber was equivalent to a modern brick school in more than 30 cities, to 2 electric power plants, each for a town of 60,000 people, and to 2 fully equipped hospitals, and that a single fighter was bought for the price of 500,000 bushels of wheat, and a single destroyer for new homes that could have housed 8,000 people. These lost opportunities to invest in people and in the economy are one of the greatest costs of military spending. Every dollar spent on the military represents a lost chance to promote economic growth and prosperity. It is necessary to invest in defense, but there must be a proper balance between defense and the nation's other priorities. The military-industrial complex has a lot of influence over government and will always use that influence to push for an expanding military budget at the expense of other important priorities. This influence must be resisted in order to find a proper balance. As Eisenhower stated in his farewell address, only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals.